I am sure that for many of you who are watching us from non-English speaking countries, the name Jacinda Ardern is probably unknown to you. Yet, in the Anglo-Saxon world, especially among progressive centre-left circles, this woman is becoming an inspiration, practically an idol of the masses. We are talking about the current Prime Minister of New Zealand, a political figure who has been labelled by pretty much all the progressive media in the Anglo-Saxon world as the antithesis of Trump, the kind of leader that anyone would want to have in his or her country, something like a new symbol of global social democracy.
Jacinda Ardern is showing the world what real leadership is: sympathy, love, and integrity. The Guardian. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, is young, forward-looking, and unabashedly liberal. Call her the anti-Trump. Vogue.
So, who exactly is Jacinda Ardern, and why on earth has she garnered so much praise from certain sectors of the international press? Well, besides being the youngest New Zealand leader in the last 150 years, she came to power at age just 37, Jacinda Ardern was also a committed Mormon until she left the very conservative church in 2005 to fight for LGBT rights. However, despite her current agnosticism and criticism of her previous faith, the truth is that the New Zealand leader of the Mormon Church has only good words to say about her. In any case, the most remarkable thing about her beginnings was not her religion, but that she spent time growing up surrounded by social problems in Murupara, a small town with a lot of Maori gang activity and one that suffered from being socially isolated. It was there that she decided to become a political figure. Ardern joined the Labour Party very early, when she was just 17, before she even began her university studies. Her first contact with real politics was her involvement in Labour politician Harry Donovan's re-election campaign for Parliament. And the fact is that, after travelling to the United Kingdom, working for 2.5 years in Tony Blair's cabinet office, and becoming president of the International Union of Socialist Youth, Ardern eventually took over the leadership of the New Zealand Labour Party in 2017. Yeah. In 2017, exactly the same year that she was elected as the youngest Prime Minister, as well as being the youngest member of that Parliament. This is all a very, very good example of what could accurately be described as a meteoric political career. Or maybe just extremely good luck. Either way, it is likely at this point that you've got more questions than answers. What led New Zealanders to trust Ardern? How did she become Prime Minister in 2017? What has driven her re-election in 2020? Has Jacinda Ardern really been such a successful leader, or is everything not as pretty as it looks? Well, we're just about to tell you, but before we get started, I just want to remind you of our new channel, Visual Academy, where we look at all the best people, places, and periods in history. It's got great animations, interesting stories, and a voiceover that I think you might recognise. You should check it out. Anyway, let's get cracking.
The Great and Controversial Coalition.
Despite her meteoric rise and the history of successes, champagne, wine and roses that she seems to have left in her wake, the truth is that Jacinda Ardern did not become Prime Minister as the favourite. The real winner of the 2017 election race was the National Party, with its candidate Bill English, the incumbent New Zealand Prime Minister, who was running for re-election after spending less than a year in the role as John Key's replacement. Key resigned precisely to make way for him. However, despite the fact that the National Party won 56 of the 120 seats, and therefore was only 5 seats short of an absolute majority, both the Maori Party and the United Future Party, which had supported the previous government, lost their seats, so that Jacinda Ardern's Labour Party managed to form an alternative coalition. And this was not your typical left-wing coalition with ideological allies. Not at all. In fact, Jacinda Ardern agreed to a coalition with New Zealand First, a right-wing party with populist overtones. There was a pact that was also made with what is called an exercise in confidence and supply from the Green Party that allowed Ardern to gain a majority and oust the National Party from power. So, to anyone's eyes, that's a real potpourri, a hodgepodge of political positions, an example of what is usually known as a Frankenstein government. The point is that this coalition was controversial because, although the Labour Party was guaranteed to return to power, it did so with an obvious minority, against the trend of what the majority of New Zealanders had voted for, and not exactly with the natural allies by its side. This is equivalent to something like a pact between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. I mean, can you imagine that? Although, now that I think about it, that actually doesn't sound so strange either. 2020's been a weird year. Anyway, to make the challenge even more complicated, the economic and employment performance that New Zealand had had during the preceding years under the leadership of the National Party had been enviable. During the Conservative government of John Key, who governed the island nation between 2008 and 2016, the country successfully weathered the Great Economic Crisis by suffering only a slight recession, after which the economy quickly returned to a scenario of solid growth. New Zealand clocked up several years with rates above 3.5% year-on-year growth. Unemployment also remained at decent levels during that period, with rates averaging between 5 and 7%. However, one of the biggest problems for the country during these years of prosperity was the high price of housing and its continuous upward trend, and that was precisely one of the great battlefields for Ardern. Given this favourable backdrop, it is not surprising that the winner of the 2017 elections was not Ardern, but English. And it is also not surprising, therefore, that Ardern would have to resort to such a coalition to take power. Now, what effect did this medley of parties and ideologies have on the Prime Minister's policies between 2017 and 2020? Yeah, in New Zealand, elections are held every 3 years, not every 4 or 5. Well, basically, the result of this Frankenstein-type coalition was immobility. In broad terms, if Jacinda Ardern had been characterised by anything during her first 2 years in office, it has been by doing little, and what little she has done discreetly. Being associated with a party like New Zealand First nipped many of Ardern's progressive aspirations in the bud, and she had to moderate her policies and turn more towards the centre. In practice, this resulted in a government that was insipid, to say the least, not very active, and incapable of delivering on a good part of the Labour electoral promises, which were centred above all on the price of housing, gender equality and child poverty. Poverty by New Zealand standards, that is. But, hold on one moment. Jacinda Ardern has just swept the 2020 elections that were held in October. We are talking about nothing less than the first absolute majority since the country's 1996 political reform. So the question is, how on earth is it possible that Jacinda Ardern has crushed it and has had such a triumphant victory in this election? Especially when, at the beginning of the year, in January 2020, she was not even leading in the polls. At that time, the opposition leader Judith Collins was ahead. So, what could possibly have happened to make that scenario turn around so radically? Well, my friends, the fact is that soon after these polls, the coronavirus arrived. Check this out.
The historic Labour Party.
So my friends of VisualPolitik, you may have your own opinion about Jacinda Ardern, but the reality is that this young 40-year-old politician has managed to conquer the heart of New Zealand. Her Labour Party's result in the October 2020 elections was overwhelming. An absolute majority, with 64 seats out of 120, 18 more than in 2017, and 49.15% of the votes. Her Conservative rival, Judith Collins, only got 35 seats, losing a whopping 21 in just 3 years, and gaining less than 27% of the vote in total. Based on those results, you could be mistaken for thinking that Ardern's first term was an enormous political, economic, and social success. However, her party's victory is almost exclusively limited to a tremendous, stupendous, formidable, and enviable performance in managing the SARS coronavirus 2 pandemic. Take a look. From the very first minute, Jacinda Ardern's government made the decision that the pandemic response would be led by experts and scientists, and not by political or economic criteria, as was the case in Spain, the United States, and many other countries. The big difference that this decision made can be seen, especially in the New Zealand figures. In a country of almost 5 million inhabitants, this island nation has recorded fewer than 2,000 cases and 25 deaths since the beginning of the pandemic. In fact, the country has gone weeks without a single case and has even declared the eradication of the coronavirus transmission twice.
8th of June 2020. New Zealand declares itself coronavirus free after last case. Deutsche Welle. 7th of October 2020. New Zealand stamps out the virus for a second time. The New York Times.
The Ardern government's approach to the coronavirus has not only saved hundreds, possibly thousands of lives, but also thousands and thousands of jobs, and, in general, has put the country's economy in a relatively advantageous position. While in Europe, there are countries whose recessions in 2020 are already close to 20% of their GDP, New Zealand has a projected economic performance of only minus 2% year on year. And that, my friends, in the time we are living, is quite an achievement. But how on earth did they achieve such a result? Well, basically, the Kiwis locked themselves down in their country before the vast majority of countries in the world. The border lockdown to prevent foreigners from entering the country began there on February 3rd. That's right, February, and any New Zealander coming, first from China and later from any other place, had to go through a mandatory 14-day quarantine upon arrival in the country. In addition, by the end of March, New Zealand had a 4-phase warning system that established restrictions, closures, and confinements based on transmission levels. Not to mention the clear communication policy that the government has carried out towards the population, treating them as adults and therefore making them aware of the risks the virus poses, and also the importance of complying with the rules to avoid outbreaks. To cap it all, as if that wasn't enough, Jacinda Ardern has not wavered either when it comes to standing her ground. As happened, for example, with the resignation of her health minister after he skipped the quarantine imposed by a resurgence in July of 2020. A resignation that, everything indicates, was actually driven by Ardern herself.
New Zealand Health Minister David Clark quits over handling of COVID-19 outbreak. During New Zealand's lockdown, Clark was twice discovered breaching the strict stay-at-home rules. Once by going mountain biking, and a second time when he took his family for a beach trip 23 kilometers from his Dunedin home, The Guardian.
All of these early actions have made New Zealand the best Western country, at least in terms of political and social terms, at managing the pandemic, and one of the countries that's done the least damage to its economic fabric, which puts it in a very advantageous position for the future. And this has been precisely the political asset that triggered the popularity of the Prime Minister and led her to win the elections so triumphantly. And then there are those that say facing the coronavirus professionally does not win votes. Well, the situation was such that the opposition leader of the National Party, Judith Collins, believed that the only feasible flank of attack in the final stretch of her campaign had to be precisely that, to discredit the Labour Party's management of the pandemic.
Judith Collins says Jacinda Ardern lied about COVID border testing, RNZ. She promised us all, and we believed it, foolish us for believing her, that every border-facing staff in those quarantine facilities was being tested regularly. Then, when it turned out that they weren't being tested regularly, and COVID-19 had come back into the country, we were then told that only a third of them were being tested regularly. Last week, we found out in an official Information Act request, came out actually only 7% of the border-facing staff were being tested. Not 100%, not a third, not 2/3, 7. Judith Collins, National Party candidate.
But, of course, as right as Collins may have been, which she surely was, at the end of the day, what can I say? Criticising Ardern for small mistakes, given the way the pandemic has been managed in the rest of Western countries, because as if that wasn't going to work. And obviously, no, it didn't work. Perhaps the best battle line for the final stretch of the campaign would have been another, because, believe me, Ardern's shortcomings throughout her administration have been numerous. So, do you want to know what Jacinda has not done at the helm of the Kiwi country? Has her government had any notable successes beyond the pandemic? Well, let's take a look.
Great PR, but not much else.
If there is one thing that has characterised Ardern's campaign in 2020, it's been its low profile. Her rhetoric has been limited practically to selling her successes in the face of the pandemic and responding to all the attacks with evasions, but without concrete policies. She called it a positive campaign. I imagine she means non-confrontational, but from non-confrontation to political nothingness, there is only one step. And many analysts agree that Ardern has taken that step.
In this election campaign, everything that happened before the virus no longer mattered. The first 2 years no longer matter. And the only thing that people are voting on is the past 8 months. And which party's going to be the strongest and the safest over the next 3 years. And that's the reason why Jacinda Ardern and the Labour Party are so widely popular. They're the only answer for that. Morgan Godfrey, political commentator specializing in Indigenous Maori issues.
If we look back to 2017-2018, the truth is that the Ardern government has failed miserably on many issues. We will give you a few examples here. Check this out. In 2016, one of Ardern's star promises was to reverse the rapid rise in housing prices in the country, and, to that end, the main measure was to launch Kiwi Build, a programme to build 100,000 public housing units in 10 years. Well, of those 100,000 homes, only 258 have been built by the end of 2019, forcing the government to lower its own initial targets. And not only that, apart from not building these promised homes, they have not been able to reverse the rapid rise in housing prices, which already poses one of the biggest economic challenges for New Zealanders, in particular, young people. As you can see in this graph, property prices have not stopped rising throughout the country, except in Auckland. But that's not necessarily good news either. The average rent in Auckland has grown from $329 a week in September 2017 to $349 in September in 2019, an increase of about 6% in 2 years, almost 3 times the rate of inflation. And it's not just about housing. The Ardern government has also failed to improve the transport infrastructure deficit problem that New Zealand suffers from. For example, they have not built the promised light rail to Auckland Airport and have almost completely halted road construction, focusing only on maintenance of existing roads, even though their promises went another way. What they have done, however, is considerably expand the policy of social subsidies. This is where they've really gone to town. Money for families with children who earn less than 50% of the national median income. More money for college student support, and the famous free first year of university for everyone. Even though the country already had an excellent system of university equity loans that were the envy of many countries. And so begins a long list of assistance policies. We'll have to wait and see what effects sharing the wealth have on what was perhaps one of the most prosperous countries in the world. Yet, even with all this, perhaps the most shocking fact, the most surprising one, and the one that should concern New Zealanders the most, is that Jacinda Ardern claims that the world leader she respects the most is none other than current Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. Yeah, really. Pedro Sanchez.
Can you quickly name for me a current world leader that you respect?
Yes, I can. Pedro Sanchez from Spain.
For the sake of the Kiwis, I kinda hope she copies as much from him as she has copied of his disastrous management of the coronavirus in Spain, which is to say, nothing. But let's not get sidetracked. What Ardern has been reluctant to do is raise taxes and start regulating everything, perhaps because her coalition partners in her first government would not allow it. So now the question is, what will she do with an absolute majority now? Well, some Kiwi analysts believe that Jacinda won't turn too far to the left now she doesn't need to rely on the agreement of another party to carry out her proposals. The reason? Because Ardern is aware that a good part of her voters in 2020 have been people from the centre and centre-right, including National Party voters who have rewarded her for her management of the pandemic, but at the same time they are looking for moderation. If Ardern starts pushing the button on proposals that are too socialist, it could cost her her job in 3 years. And if there is a consensus on anything, it's that Ardern seeks to stay, at least for a couple more terms, as head of the country. In any case, Jacinda Ardern's re-election was a record, the biggest Labour victory in at least 50 years, after a previous term that, if we eliminated the management of the coronavirus, would have gone mostly unnoticed. The question of how long Ardern will continue to lead New Zealand is a mystery, but what seems clear is that an icon of Anglo-Saxon social democracy has been born, an icon that could even become a benchmark for the global left. So, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Don't forget to check out our friends too at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided all the vocals in this episode that were not my dulcet tones. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And, as always, I'll see you next time.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.